suspects are being one case involves. The FBI is now offering $100,000 to see if the police are releasing.
Welcome to Missy Mysteries. I'm your host, Kaylee, and this is a true crime and paranormal podcast. Today is a true crime topic, but it is so much more, and I am so excited. I won't be talking about one particular missing person or an unsolved case. I am going to be talking about the true crime community and true crime content as a whole. This is a special project I have been working on since the start of the year that includes other podcasters and family or friends of victims. This project was all about me learning and diving into ethical true crime and putting together content to help not only other creators learn about ethical true crime, but to help true crime fans understand it better as well. Before beginning, I want to break down exactly how this worked. I set up a series of questions for true crime creators and a separate set of questions for the families and friends who agreed to work with me. They recorded their responses so they had enough time and had full control over what was put on the podcast, and then they sent their audio over to me. I then edited them into these episodes. My 3 guests for this project are Robin Warder from the Trail Went Cold podcast. Each week on the Trail Went Cold, Robin focuses on a victim or victims that case are currently cold cases. The friends of Kelly Brannon. Kelly has been missing since July 15th of 2020. I talked about her in September of 2021 on episode 18, but her friends are going to tell you a lot more about Kelly, and I will have a special YouTube video that they sent me for her in the episode description. And Dana Pohl from True Crime PI podcast. On True Crime PI, Dana takes a season to investigate and share the stories of unsolved, missing, murdered, and unidentified persons cases. I want to thank all of my guests for working with me on this and for helping me share how important the topic of ethical true crime truly is. At this point, you may be asking yourself, what is ethical true crime? I'm going to answer this question by answering the same questions that I asked Robin and Dana. First question I asked them was, what does ethical true crime mean to you, and how would you describe it? Ethical true crime to me comes down to the treatment of the victims of these awful crimes or situations, and for those who didn't make it, the treatment of their loved ones and the families they left behind. It's all about remembering that in true crime, we are talking about real people who lost their lives, their loved ones that are left without them, or people who have experienced something very traumatic and awful in their lifetime. Think about these people as your mother, your sister, your brother, your father, your best friend, your husband. Now, the second question is, when did you first hear about ethical true crime, and how did you hear about it? I first heard about ethical true crime only a few months after getting into podcasting for myself. Without realizing, it was pretty much a part of why I started this podcast. From a young age, I always watched shows like The First 48, How to Catch a Predator, Dr. G Medical Examiner, and I even remember being a young child watching the trial of Casey Anthony happen on live TV. True crime content have always been a part of my life. When I became an adult, I was introduced to podcasts, and I remember a few months before starting Missy Mysteries, I just became so tired of trying to watch documentaries or listen to podcasts that I felt glorified the crimes or the killers and often disrespected the victims or their families. It made me want to start a podcast where I focus on the victims and tell the stories of the people who need our help, which I did, but I didn't realize that what I wanted for the podcast could be considered ethical or what the movement even was until being tagged into a list of ethical creators on Twitter by Paige from Revere True Crime, and then finding Sarah Turney. If you haven't looked her up, please look her up. She has her own podcast, and she is just really leading this movement for the change in the true crime community. And the third question, do you have any particular cases that you feel is a perfect example of why you need better ethics in a true crime community? What comes to mind when I think about specific cases that really make me think about the need for ethical true crime? First two that come to mind are Mara Murray, or Liberty German and Abby Williams. I often feel like when these girls are talked about, it's not done with the intent to help or share their stories, but often to point fingers, especially at family, and often spread harmful misinformation. The fourth question: how can true crime content creators such as podcasters, YouTubers, filmmakers, and documentarians make sure that they're putting out ethical content or raising more awareness to ethical issues in true crime? For true crime content creators, I know we often don't want to bother the families, but for me, when I find it's appropriate, such as the families who really lead the cause for their loved ones, I like to ask permission before I talk about their loved ones. And when it seems like the family doesn't really want to talk, or they have expressed that they don't want their loved one's story shared, I will make the decision not to talk about it or share it, even if their story has been requested. I try to always make sure the family is fully aware and even give them the opportunity to send me their personal stories or audios of what they would like said on the podcast before the episode is made. We can also make sure we are never pointing the blame at the victims or making jokes on their behalves. I also feel it is important to include links for GoFundMes, social media, or pages that the families have made, and any petitions that will help their cases. We can choose to talk about things that are being said that seem unethical and ask people not to share these things that seem more harmful than helpful. The fifth and the last question: how can listeners or audience of true crime content make sure that what they are watching or listening to is ethical? Now, this is a big question. As a content creator, I never want to point blame on the people who are just consuming the content, because I feel like a lot of ethical true crime comes back to the creators. But ultimately, as a listener, it just comes down to what you are sharing or watching. Just being able to tell your favorite creators when they may have crossed the line so they can correct it. Whatever the content may be, podcasts, documentaries, or videos, it's important to hold content creators liable. Now that I have answered the same questions I asked my guest, I'm going to start by sharing with you the audio from Kelly's friends, but I will be reading the questions they answered before playing the audio. First, I would like to give you a chance to tell us about your loved one, your favorite story, who they were, what made them them, or funny things they said or did.
Our friend Kelly Brannon has been missing since July 2020, which has been absolutely devastating. Kelly was unforgettable, a force to be reckoned with, and her absence is felt so profoundly. Kelly was an artist, musician, writer, and activist who created a sense of community wherever she went. There's just so much to say about her. We created a video to try and communicate how special Kelly was, so please check it out on our YouTube channel, Friends of Kelly Brannon.
Before you lost your loved one, did you ever watch or listen to true crime content? Do you still watch it or listen to it, and has that changed?
Our group is made up of numerous people, and we all have different interests. Some of us have been casual consumers of true crime content, such as watching unsolved mysteries and forensic files, or listening to podcasts like Serial. We met a few truly amazing people in the true crime community who have worked tirelessly to bring Kelly justice, which has been wonderful. But after going through something like this personally, it makes watching and listening to true crime pretty unappealing. It is disturbing to watch other people suffer the way we have.
How do you feel about the true crime community and the recent talks about ethical true crime? The true crime community can include social media, such as Reddit, podcasts, YouTube, TikTok, movies, and documentaries. How do you define ethical true crime, and what does it mean to you?
It's really tough because podcasters are essentially capitalizing off of the worst tragedies people could ever experience. However, garnering media attention is essential and, as we've seen many times now, sometimes critical in helping to solve these cases. While a part of you wants nothing to do with it, the other part wants to and really needs to engage with as much media as possible to raise awareness and hopefully get answers and justice. When looking at this objectively, it is clear that some true crime operates from an ethical and empathetic place with the genuine goal of helping the victim. Other times, though, it is painfully obvious that it is purely self-serving and all about money and fame, or the pursuit of it anyway. While we are admittedly not well versed in this subject, it seems pretty clear that engaging in true crime in an ethical manner mandates centering the voice of the missing and not talking over or disrespecting their community of friends and family. Think about your intention. Imagine it is your child, your spouse, your partner, your friend. Then act from that place. You are in a supportive role. If you observe others in the community acting in a way that causes harm, speak out. That is invaluable and a critical part of engaging in this in an ethical way. We always take notice. We are eternally grateful to the podcasters who have gotten this right. We see how hard you work and how attentive you are to all the details, and we know you're doing this because you truly care. We will never, ever forget what you did for Kelly.
If you could send a message or give any sort of advice for your family or the families affected by these crimes to true crime content creators, what would you like to tell them?
You have the opportunity to help or to harm. Your platform gives you power, maybe more than you even realize. That is a lot of responsibility. Reflect on your intention. Always remember that this shouldn't be about the victim. It should be for them. Lastly, if you say you are going to do something, do it. If you no longer can fulfill your promises, just own up to it and explain why. We've been ghosted by some pretty high-profile true crime podcasters and journalists, which is really disgusting and unforgivable. It all comes down to this. Treat others as you'd want to be treated.
And the last question, for the audience of true crime content, how can they make sure what they're watching or listening to is ethical and doesn't cause more trauma for the family? Is there anything you would like to talk about or raise awareness to that can help bring your loved one justice or help your family?
Listen very closely. Consider the evidence. Observe for coded language. Ask yourself if you are perpetuating stereotypes or spreading unfounded rumors. What words are you using to describe the victim? How about their abuser, if there is one? Are you passing judgment or are you expressing concern? As always, what is your intention? What is your goal? Why are you here? Listen to the family and friends of the missing. Do not attempt to silence their voices or prioritize your own. To them, this is not a podcast, an episode, a hashtag, or a fleeting story soon to be replaced. This is forever.
Thank you to the friends of Kelly. I appreciate being able to not only hear your side and work with you, but to hear more about Kelly. These are truly very thoughtful and wonderful responses that I know for me made me think. Robin and Dana have asked and answered the questions in their audio, so I will play both of their audios for you, playing Dana's first.
My name is Dana Pohl. I am a librarian who has been researching missing and unidentified people for 15 years. Like many of you, I listened to several true crime podcasts, and then one day I realized that I could use my years of knowledge and research to create my own podcast. True Crime PI is an investigative podcast that focuses on missing and unidentified persons cases from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. As fate would have it, my first episode took on a life of its own and grew into a 7-part series. It started with the story of a Jane Doe found in Cobb County, Georgia in 1984, and ended in the naming of a potential suspect, serial killer Samuel Little, which then led to a re-examination of the case by a Georgia task force. While the task force is doing their thing, the medical examiner has sent her DNA to be profiled. Fingers crossed, one day soon she will be identified. Season 2 includes a series on the disappearance of Lonine Ray Rogers. This series includes interviews with her sister, her daughter, and her son, and dives deep into Lonine's childhood, her marriage, the day she went missing, and the ripple effect her disappearance has had on her children. It illustrates just how destructive the unbearable burden of not knowing can be for the family members who are left behind. You can listen to True Crime PI anywhere you get your podcasts.
First question, what does ethical true crime mean to you, and how would you describe it?
Ethical true crime means telling the stories of the missing, murdered, and unidentified in a fact-based, victim and family-focused way. It means always respecting the family's wishes and never forgetting that these are the stories of real people and their families.
Now, the second question is, when did you first hear about ethical true crime and how did you hear about it?
To be honest, I've been thinking about the concept of ethical true crime for many years. I began researching and advocating for the missing and unidentified nearly 15 years ago. Along the way, I have met people whose words and actions are steeped in compassion and understanding, and others who appear to be driven by a force that I perceive as less than ethical. I began to discuss my views on ethical true crime last year when I became a founding member of Uncovered. Uncovered is creating a database of missing and murdered people and fostering a community of informed citizen detectives who research cases and help families in an ethical way. By creating crowdsourcing opportunities and implementing calls to action, Uncovered aims to move the public's consumption of true crime from interest to advocacy. In addition, I have listened to and read everything that Sarah Turney has said on this subject. She has used her own experiences to challenge content creators and the media to share cases in an ethical way and to treat families with respect. I admire Sarah's work, and I believe that first and foremost, true crime content should be created to help victims and their families find answers. Personally, I choose to create and consume true crime content that is victim-focused and carefully designed to educate the public and generate leads.
And the third question, do you have any particular cases that you feel is a perfect example of why you need better ethics in a true crime community?
I don't have a particular case, but I will tell you about a personal experience. Season 2, Episode 9, I covered the case of Sandra K. Pohl. Sandra was just 4 days shy of her 17th birthday when she went missing on March 11, 1987, from South Bend, Indiana. While researching the case, I realized that the last time her case was covered by the local media was in 2014. This upset me, so I decided to see if I could drum up some media coverage for her case. I sent emails to 10 reporters in South Bend. One of the 10 contacted me the next day and said that she was going to cover the story. She asked me if I had the contact information for Sandra's family. I didn't, but I suggested that she contact the lieutenant I had interviewed for the episode. Because she asked, I assumed she would reach out to the family. Sandra's story was shared on the evening news, which is great, right? I had done what I had set out to do, get her story some much-needed exposure. The problem was the reporter never contacted the family. Suddenly, I realized what I had done. I imagined Sandra's mom sitting down to watch the news in the privacy of her own home and being blindsided by a story about her missing child. I have to wonder how that made her feel. Was she happy? Was she sad? Would she prefer Sandra's case be covered or left uncovered? I realized that although my intention was to help, my actions may have actually done more harm than good. I didn't reach out to Sandra's mother for the episode because I don't approach families who haven't expressed an interest in speaking with me about their missing loved ones. In the future, I have decided that I am not going to push for coverage on cases if I don't have the family's consent. I want to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem.
The fourth question, how can true crime content creators such as podcasters, YouTubers, filmmakers, and documentarians make sure that they're putting out ethical content or raising more awareness to ethical issues in true crime?
As content creators, we can listen to and respect the wishes of a victim's family. We can share our thoughts, experiences, and mistakes, model ethical behaviors, and learn from one another. We can also join organizations like Uncovered, where ethical case research, content creation, and discussions are happening every day.
The fifth and the last question, How can listeners or audience of true crime content make sure that what they are watching or listening to is ethical?
Consumers who want to support ethical true crime creators should look for content that is fact-based and victim and family-centered. We must remember that these are the stories of real people, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and friends. Ideally, every missing, murdered, and unidentified case should be viewed or listened to for the purpose of understanding and advocacy.
Hello everyone, this is Robin Mortar, host of the true crime podcast, The Trail Went Cold, and I'm here for this special edition of Misty Mysteries in order to answer some questions Keely has posed about the ethics of true crime, which is definitely a very important subject. In case you haven't heard of my show, The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast where every episode covers a different unsolved mystery and cold case, and you can find us at trailwentcold.com. At the time of this recording, we're about to reach our 6-year anniversary, and I can tell you that the true crime podcast landscape is a much different place than when I originally started in February of 2016. Back then, there were only a handful of true crime podcasts, and the genre was just about to hit a boom period, so the medium was pretty much the Wild West, and in many ways, it still is. Here we are 6 years later, and there are now thousands of true crime podcasts out there, because podcasting is a medium where any independent creator can start their own show. However, because there is so much creative freedom in the genre, there really aren't any specific rules and regulations to follow, which is why the topic of true crime ethics has become a heavily discussed one in recent years. Now, our first question is, what does ethical true crime mean to you, and how would you describe it? Well, I've always believed that the one thing all true crime creators should remember is that all of your content is based on real-life events which destroyed real people's lives, so you should always be mindful and respectful of the victims and their loved ones. Since The Trail Went Cold exclusively covers unsolved cold cases, it definitely puts more focus on the victim than the perpetrator, since we don't even know who the perpetrator was, but you don't want to glorify these individuals who did commit these terrible crimes. One thing true crime creators should always keep in mind is that a victim's family or friends could easily come across your podcast and listen to it, so you want to be careful about saying anything which might upset or offend them. And I know that some of the most popular shows in the genre are a combination of true crime and comedy that attempt to find humor in these horrible situations, which is why independent creators will sometimes take this approach when they start their own podcast. And while the true crime comedy subgenre can work, you once again have to remember that you're making jokes about a real-life tragedy which affected real people, so ask yourself how these people would react if they listened to your episode about their story. I have been contacted by friends and family members of victims who heard my episode about their story on The Trail Went Cold, and the responses have mostly been positive, as more often than not, they were appreciative of the fact that I was bringing attention to a case which was still unsolved. But I'm sure it would be the absolute worst feeling in the world if they told me I did wrong, or that my episode hurt them and reopened some painful wounds. So I think that the best way to define ethical true crime is retelling a story about the worst day of someone's life in the most respectful fashion possible and doing justice to the victim's memory. So our next question is, when did you first hear about ethical true crime, and how did you hear about it? Well, I think one of the big reasons this has become a heavily discussed topic in recent years is because the family members of victims of terrible crimes have started becoming podcasters themselves. One of the first persons I would frequently see bring up the subject of ethical true crime on social media is Sarah Turney, who has spent years fighting for justice in the disappearance of her older sister, Alyssa Turney. After appearing on a number of podcasts to share her sister's story, Sarah eventually started her own true crime podcast called Voices for Justice, which not only provided coverage of Alyssa's case, but now features episodes about other unsolved cold cases. Another bereaved family member who has done the same thing is Eric Carter Landine, who is seeking justice for the murder of his baby brother Jacob from many years ago. Eric also decided to start his own podcast called True Consequences, where he has not only shared Jacob's story, but is now shining a light on other unsolved cold cases. I think it's a pretty important game changer for the genre that people like Sarah and Eric, whose lives were drastically affected by true crime, have started podcasts of their own because they are able to provide a unique viewpoint and would know better than anyone how to handle this subject respectfully and ethically. Back when I started The Trail Went Cold in 2016, I'm not sure there were any true crime podcasts hosted by family members or friends of murdered or missing victims, So I think that giving a voice to podcasters who have experienced the situation firsthand is a great way to shine a spotlight on true crime ethics. Our next question is, are there any particular cases that you feel are a perfect example of why we need better ethics in the true crime community? Well, I'm not going to call out anyone specifically, but there are a few prominent cold cases out there which have managed to generate a lot of personal drama, which sometimes overshadows the case itself. And if you follow this genre at all, you'll probably be able to figure out which cases they are. Ever since I started The Trail Went Cold, I've always gravitated towards lesser-known cold cases which have not been covered much on other podcasts, but there are some cases which I've shied away from because of a fear that it might bring about a lot of drama involving trolls and attention seekers. And that's a terrible feeling to have, since the primary goal of covering an unsolved cold case should be to put it out there in the spotlight and increase the chances of it being solved. Yet there are few cases in which you're overwhelmed by the feeling that there's going to be a ton of additional baggage if you attempt to tackle it. I really hate to see bereaved family members of missing and murdered victims get harassed by trolls or dragged into heated arguments on social media, but it does happen, usually because someone crossed some sort of major ethical line. So yes, if the victim and their story is not the primary focal point, and it winds up being pushed to the side by petty drama, this only means that ethics in true crime need some improvement. However, I do want to mention one specific case, and that's the death of Elisa Lam, as I've always personally believed that her death was nothing more than a tragic accident, yet the true crime community wound up blowing the entire story out of proportion with endless speculation and conspiracy theories, and falsely accusing innocent people of her murder. The Netflix documentary about the story, Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel, paints a pretty bleak picture of how a victim's tragic death can be exploited when all true crime ethics are tossed out the window. The next question is, how can podcasters, YouTubers, filmmakers, and documentarians make sure they are putting out ethical content, or raise more awareness to the ethical issues in true crime? Well, I'm certainly not going to pretend that The Trail Went Cold is perfect when it comes to true crime ethics, and I'm sure most true crime creators would say the exact same thing. This is one medium where you will make mistakes, but hopefully learn as you go along. I think the most important rule is that we never lose our sense of empathy and remember that real people out there have their lives ruined in the stories we share. I actually experienced a bit of a wake-up call nearly 3 years ago when I participated in a live show at the True Crime Podcast Festival and talked about an unsolved cold case involving a university professor who was murdered 2 decades ago. Well, believe it or not, it turned out that one of the audience members at the show had actually been a student in this professor's class at the time he was killed, and she started crying when she heard his story again. I mean, given that this crime occurred in Toronto and the True Crime Podcast Festival was held in Chicago, what are the odds of something like this happening? Thankfully, even though this person became emotional, she was still very appreciative of me bringing attention to the case again, but I can only imagine what a horrible situation that could have been if I had shared this victim's story in a disrespectful or unethical fashion. It was a very vivid reminder of how true crime creators need to handle the retelling of a victim's tragedy as sensitively as possible, because you never know who might be listening. Now, The Trail Went Cold is a bit unique, since I exclusively cover unsolved cold cases, so there's always the assumption that the victim's loved ones will appreciate the additional exposure for their case. However, the situation might be different if your podcast only covers solved cases which have reached a definitive conclusion, as there's always the risk that putting these stories back into the spotlight might reopen old wounds for the victim's loved ones. So this is when you have to ask yourself, is there a good reason to put this person's story out into the world again, and are you honoring their memory? If the answer is yes, then by all means, put together an episode about it, but always be mindful that someone whose life was affected by this story might be listening. And if you're comfortable addressing the issue of ethics and true crime on your show, then by all means do so. Many people know that I'm probably the biggest fan there is of the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, but if my podcast has covered cases they once featured and I found issues with their presentation of the story, I have not hesitated to say so. And our last question, how can the audience for true crime content make sure that what they are watching and listening to is ethical? Well, obviously, if this is a very important topic for you, then I would make sure to do the necessary research by looking up what you can online about true crime creators. Because if they've done anything highly unethical, that information is going to be out there somewhere, and you can decide for yourself whether or not you want to consume their content. Much like creators, I do think that audiences should take a moment and put themselves in the shoes of someone who has experienced a personal tragedy and had their life greatly affected by crime. If you're listening to a podcast or watching a documentary or a YouTube video about a certain case, and you think to yourself, if I was this victim's loved one, I would be pretty upset by how they're handling this, then by all means, turn it off. But don't let unethical true crime content turn you off from the entire genre, because there are still so many content creators out there who do it right. So if true crime ethics means a lot to you, be sure to stick with the creators whom you believe are handling the subject matter respectfully. So that about brings an end to my discussion about ethical true crime, and a big thanks to Keely for inviting me to participate in this project. Hopefully, this has given you a lot of food for thought, and focusing attention on this topic will help lead to a lot of positive changes in the true crime community.
Wow, both Dana and Robin did such an amazing job and also gave such thoughtful and wonderful responses. I truly feel like not only did I learn from all three of my guests, but I'm so thankful for being able to work with them and get their perspectives about ethics in the true crime community. I'm grateful that I was able to do this episode for all of you and that I have been able to work with the families to really get a better idea of how I can help missing people and victims of cold cases. I would love to hear more from the true crime community about the ethics in the community and how I, myself as a podcaster, can do better and can serve the community better. I want to leave this discussion open for everybody to truly talk about what we need to change and what we need to see in the true crime community. For now, I want to thank my guest again for being on, especially friends with Kelly. You guys are so amazing, and I truly appreciate you being able to talk to me about Kelly. I know these things can be hard. I want to thank everybody for listening today. Everyone that worked with me on this project, I will have links to their podcasts and their pages and any special videos they want put, especially for Kelly, in my episode description. Please stay safe, stay hydrated, and I will see you next week.